Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we sift through a mountain of source material to bring you the essential nuggets of knowledge. Today, we're journeying back to a monumental period of post-colonial nation-building and Cold War strategy, all centered around one single structure, the Aswan Dam in Egypt.
It's a fantastic topic.
It really is. And this isn't just a story about moving rock and pouring concrete. It's a masterclass in massive human ambition and, its dramatic dual-edged consequences.
Absolutely.
Built between 1960 and 1970 across the mighty Nile near Aswan, this dam was seen as absolutely pivotal to securing Egypt's future. The goals were pretty clear, right?
Oh, completely. Better control of the devastating annual Nile flooding, creating vast water storage for irrigation, and of course generating enough hydroelectricity to power a nation into the industrial age.
And that really defines our mission for this deep dive.
It does. We've been given sources that cover the dams, just immense engineering specs, the incredibly intense geopolitical drama that secured its funding, and then the complex, controversial long-term effects that are still playing out, decades later. It's a massive story of trade-offs.
So to set the stage for everyone, we have to understand the historical moment. This wasn't the first dam at Aswan.
Not at all. The High Dam was built about 7 kilometers upstream of the Aswan Low Dam, which was an earlier British project completed way back in 1902. But the High Dam was different.
In its ambition, you mean?
In its very philosophy. It wasn't about simply managing the river, it was about domesticating it. For literally thousands of years, farming in the Nile Valley relied on the predictable but also dangerous annual flood.
The flood that left behind all that rich silt.
Exactly. The High Dam was designed to end this dependence forever, to eliminate both the destructive high water years that wiped out crops and the devastating low water years that brought famine, and just replace all of that with a regulated, multi-year, stable water supply.
Okay, so let's unpack that history. The very idea of trying to tame the Nile right there at Aswan is not new at all. It's ancient.
It goes way back. Our sources mention the earliest documented attempt goes all the way back to the 11th century.
And it's a great story.
It's a fantastic anecdote. It really speaks to the sheer ambition involved. The engineer was Ibn al-Haytham, known as Al-Hazen in the West, a brilliant Arab polymath. He was summoned by the Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakim by Amr Allah,
who had heard of his genius and basically demanded a solution to the Nile's unpredictability.
Right. But Al-Haytham, after actually going out and doing the field work, he realized the scale of the Nile was just far too great for the technology they had in the 11th century.
So what did he do? He was in a really tough spot.
An impossible position. I mean, he concluded the scheme was utterly impractical. But admitting failure to a famously volatile caliph like Al-Hakim, well, that would likely have gotten him executed.
So he feigned madness.
He did. He pretended to be insane to escape the caliph's wrath, and he was put under house arrest for about a decade. And this is where the story gets really interesting.
Okay.
During that period of house arrest, he wrote the seminal Book of Optics, which laid the foundations for modern physics and optics.
Wow.
So the failure of this monumental engineering project inadvertently gave the world one of its greatest scientific triumphs.
That's a perfect encapsulation of how ambition and reality can clash. So let's fast forward 1,000 years. The British build the Low Dam, but that's just a stepping stone.
Right.
Then you have the 1952 revolution in Egypt. The new military regime under Gamal Abdel Nasser has this overwhelming urge for national modernization and, I guess, sovereignty.
That's it, exactly. Nasser and the Free Officers Movement were not going to accept engineering plans devised by their former colonial masters, so they very quickly accepted the plan for a high dam.
A different plan, developed by a Greek-Egyptian engineer, Adrian Antoninous.
Right, and it was explicitly favored over the competing British Nile Valley plan.
And the British plan was to store water further south, right? In Sudan and Ethiopia, where evaporation would be lower.
It was, which might have been more efficient hydraulically. But the choice of the Antoninous plan storing all the water inside Egypt was a powerful political statement.
A declaration of post-colonial control.
Absolutely. The decision wasn't just about efficiency, it was strategic, it was political. The regime was convinced that the Nile waters had to be stored in Egypt to ensure complete national sovereignty.
Relying on upstream nations or a foreign design was just not an option.
It was antithetical to the revolution's goals. This dam was going to be an Egyptian project, reflecting Egyptian ambition. And within just 2 months of them taking power, the Antoninous plan was greenlit.
And a project of this scale instantly throws Egypt into the vortex of the Cold War.
Immediately.
Suddenly, this national infrastructure project becomes a pawn in the global chess match between East and West. Both the U.S. and the USSR want to finance it.
Well, the initial interest came from the West. In 1955, the U.S. and the U.K. offered a pretty considerable financial package, a $270 million loan.
But as always in the Cold War, there were strings attached.
Very thick strings. The money was laced with political conditions designed to tether Nasser to the Western sphere of influence.
And what were those specific conditions that Nasser found so objectionable?
Well, they were heavy. The U.S. and U.K. conditioned the loan on Nasser, playing a role in resolving the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict.
Okay, that's a big ask.
It is. And more critically, for Nasser's sense of national dignity, the Americans insisted on having their own military personnel on the ground for supervision, for training.
So a level of foreign oversight.
Exactly, on this centerpiece of Egyptian nationalism. And for Nasser, who was pursuing a policy of tactical neutrality, trying not to align with either superpower, this was just unacceptable.
At the same time, Nasser desperately needed to modernize his military.
Desperately. A major Israeli raid on Gaza in February 1955 had really exposed Egypt's vulnerability. He's trying to lead the Pan-Arab movement, and he can't do that if he can't defend his own borders.
So when the U.S. says no to arms without these conditions,
he sees an opening with the East. He reaches out to the Soviets. And the American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who was notoriously dismissive of neutral nations, he just thought Nasser was bluffing.
But he wasn't bluffing. How quickly did that deal with the Soviet bloc come together?
Astonishingly fast. On September 27, 1955, Nasser announces this landmark arms deal, brokered through Czechoslovakia, which was acting as a Soviet middleman. It was a direct signal.
A signal that Egypt would pursue its own interests, regardless of Western approval.
Precisely. And that action alone should have been the end of the Western funding offer. But the sources show the U.S. and U.K. actually made one last-ditch effort. They did. They recognized the danger of losing Egypt entirely to the Soviet sphere. So in December 1955, they pledged $56 million and $14 million respectively toward the dam. But the political relationship just kept fraying.
So what was the final straw? The immediate tipping point that made the U.S. completely pull the plug?
Our sources are clear. It was Nasser's diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China in May 1956.
A huge act of defiance against Dulles' policy.
A profound one. It treated any recognition of communist powers as a hostile act. So you combine that with the arms deal and the resentment from pro-Western allies like Turkey and Iraq.
Who felt Egypt was being rewarded for its neutrality.
Right. It just made the dam a political impossibility for the U.S. administration.
Our liability was too great.
By July 1956, the State Department made the announcement. American financial assistance for the high dam was not feasible in present circumstances. The UK followed right behind them.
Leaving Nasser isolated and seemingly unable to afford his mega-project, the world just held its breath.
But this perceived weakness, this turned into Nasser's greatest strategic victory. The Soviets saw their chance for a huge geopolitical win, and they stepped right into the vacuum.
A defining moment of the Cold War.
Absolutely. The USSR proceeded to provide comprehensive support. Between 1958 and 1960, they extended credits totaling $425 million.
And the terms were very favorable.
Incredibly so. A remarkably low 2.5% interest rate, repayable over 12 years. This funding covered basically all the foreign exchange needs for the dam technical services, imported power generating equipment, all the crucial construction machinery.
And the design itself became a monument to this Soviet-Egyptian cooperation.
It did. The colossal embankment dam was designed by the Hydro Project Institute in Moscow under Nikolai Alexandrovich Malyshev, who worked hand-in-hand with Egyptian engineers. It wasn't just money. It was the largest and most prominent foreign aid project the USSR had ever undertaken.
Securing a massive strategic foothold in the Middle East.
That's right.
But hold on. That $425 million only covered the foreign costs. The domestic costs for construction, paying workers, moving earth, local materials, those were still astronomical. Where did Nasser find the money for that?
He gave the answer with one of the most famous and dramatic announcements of the 20th century, less than a week after the U.S. withdrawal.
On July 26, 1956, he announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal.
Exactly. Declaring that the revenues generated by the now Egyptian-controlled waterway would help fund the high dam.
The audacity of that move instantly sparked the Suez War.
It did. The UK, France, and Israel tried to seize the canal. They were eventually forced to withdraw due to immense pressure from both the U.S. and the USSR at the United Nations.
So the dam was, in a very real sense, built on the back of this geopolitical defiance.
It was. And the sources confirmed that economically the move was sound. The debt repayments to the USSR were modest and were quickly offset by increased export earnings from the new reclaimed land. The project became self-funding relatively quickly.
A phenomenal high-stakes origin story. So now that we understand the politics, let's appreciate the sheer engineering scale of what the Soviet and Egyptian teams actually built.
Well, that spectacular political success really demanded an equally spectacular feat of engineering.
Mm.
And the scale, it's just difficult to grasp. We're talking about an embankment dam that is 3,830 meters long.
That's nearly 2.5 miles across the Nile Valley.
It is, and the structure itself is just colossal. It's 111 meters tall.
364 feet, so like a 30-story skyscraper.
Roughly, yeah. And its base is 980 meters wide, nearly a kilometer, which makes it incredibly stable. The amount of rock, clay, and sand that went into this structure is staggering. 43 million cubic meters of material.
43 million cubic meters. That sounds like an abstraction. Can you put that into a more tangible perspective for us?
Well, think about the biggest structures you know. That volume is enough to build roughly 35 Great Pyramids of Giza. Or enough material to pave a road 5 feet deep from Cairo all the way to Moscow. It was an enormous logistical challenge. You had about 25,000 Egyptian engineers and workers operating nonstop for a decade.
And when it was completed, it was the largest earthen dam in the world.
It was. And the outcome, of course, is Lake Nasser, one of the largest man-made reservoirs ever created.
Its metrics are just as astounding.
They are. The lake stretches 500 kilometers long over 300 miles and covers a vast surface area of 5,250 square kilometers. Its total capacity is a monumental 132 cubic kilometers of water.
That is enough water to cover the entire country of Belgium in 1.5 feet of water.
It is, and our sources gave a crucial long-term projection about the reservoir concerning siltation.
Right, because all reservoirs eventually fill with sediment.
They do. However, the sheer size of Lake Nasser means that conservative estimates indicate the dam will provide at least 200 years of service, effectively securing Egypt's water supply for 2 centuries. The majority of the Nile sediment is now just deposited harmlessly in the enormous lake.
Okay, let's talk about the primary benefit: drought protection and agricultural expansion. How did the dam immediately deliver on that promise of stability?
The sources confirm it delivered right on time, protecting Egypt from disaster almost immediately after the reservoir began filling. The sheer size of the lake meant it could store multi-year reserves,
Which protected Egypt from those severe, prolonged droughts that devastated so much of Africa in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. While its neighbors suffered, Egypt maintained stability and continued to feed its rapidly growing population.
And that stability allowed for a massive agricultural transformation. What kind of land reclamation did the dam enable?
It was revolutionary. Egypt reclaimed about 840,000 hectares of land.
Which is equivalent to 1/3 of the country's entire irrigated area. That's huge.
It is. This involved bringing formerly desert land into production and using hundreds of thousands of hectares that were previously just for seasonal flood retention.
The sources also note that pivotal shift in farming method, from basin irrigation to perennial irrigation.
And this is the key to understanding the long-term environmental trade-offs we'll get to later. Before the dam, most agriculture in Upper Egypt relied on one annual flood, one crop per year.
But the high dam's stable water supply allowed 420,000 hectares to be converted to perennial irrigation.
Which meant farmers could now grow 2 or even 3 crops annually.
A profound increase in productivity. Did that translate into immediate economic and social changes?
Immediately. The stable water also dramatically boosted yields on land that was already irrigated. Our sources cite that wheat yields in Egypt roughly tripled between 1952 and 1991, with better water management being a major factor.
And socially, this was nation building.
It was. An estimated 500,000 families were settled onto these new, productive lands. The high dam essentially allowed Egypt to utilize about 22 cubic kilometers of water that had previously just flowed unused into the Mediterranean.
Even after you factor in the very substantial evaporation from the lake.
Right, which is estimated to be between 10 and 16 cubic kilometers per year. A huge number, but still a net gain.
So the second monumental driver for the dam, beyond irrigation, was electricity. This was the key to rapid modernization.
It was a monumental leap forward for the entire nation. The power station has 12 huge generators, each rated at 175 megawatts, giving the dam an installed capacity of 2.1 gigawatts.
And when it reached peak output in the early 70s, it was supplying around half of Egypt's total electric power.
Supplying half the national grid almost overnight. That's a statement. It meant bringing electricity to villages all across Egypt for the very first time.
The societal transformation must have been undeniable.
It was. And the dam also helped increase the efficiency of the older Aswan hydropower stations downstream by regulating the water flows they received. At its completion, it was the sixth largest hydroelectric station in the world.
But here's where we hit the first real complexity, because our sources have an important caveat that distinguishes the theoretical capacity from what the plant actually sustains.
Yes, this takes us back to the dam's dual purpose. The technical studies estimate the sustained long-term output is actually closer to 5 billion kilowatts per year.
About half the theoretical maximum.
Exactly. And the reason is a conflict in resource demands between power generation and agriculture.
The competing demands for water create a bottleneck.
Precisely. The demand for irrigation water for crops, especially hungry summer crops, is highest during the summer months. So when Egypt is diverting massive volumes of water for farming, it limits the volume and pressure of water available to run the turbines at full capacity, particularly in the winter.
So the priority of food security inherently curbs the full potential power output.
It has to. The needs of the farm must come before the needs of the grid.
That brings us squarely to part 3, the double-edged sword. When humanity engineers a change of this scale, there are always trade-offs. We have to start with the human and cultural cost, which, according to the sources, was just devastating.
We're talking about the loss of Lower Nubia. The formation of Lake Nasser completely flooded a massive, historically and culturally rich region. It meant relocating between 100,000 and 120,000 people.
An entire ancient culture displaced.
Both Sudanese and Egyptian Nubians, who had lived along the Nile using traditional practices for millennia.
Can you detail the scale of that relocation?
It was immense, and it was traumatic. The Sudanese Nubians, maybe 50,000 to 70,000 of them, were moved from their homeland near Wadi Halfa. Some were resettled nearby, but a large group were moved 700 kilometers south to the Vitana Plain.
Moving 700 kilometers from a near rainless desert to a semi-arid plain with seasonal rains. That must have been a fundamental shock to their way of life.
A total transformation. They were settled in standardized planned villages, given irrigated land, but their social structure, their economic base, their deep cultural connection to the riverbanks they knew, all severed.
And the Egyptian Nubians.
About 50,000 of them were resettled a shorter distance near Kamambo into New Nubia. They were given a new land, housing. But the profound long-term nature of this injustice is shown by the fact that the Egyptian government only began compensating them for lost homes between 2019 and 2020.
Decades later.
Decades.
And the cultural cost extended beyond the people to irreplaceable historical artifacts, prompting one of the largest archaeological rescue operations in history.
The UNESCO Nubia campaign. It was an incredible international effort to mitigate the cultural loss. 22 major monuments, some dating back to pharaonic times, were threatened by the rising waters.
The most famous, of course, being the rescue of the Abu Simbel temples.
That's the one everyone knows. And they didn't just move it, they physically disassembled it, stone by heavy stone, and rebuilt it piece by piece on higher ground, nearly 200 feet above its original location.
An incredible feat.
Other priceless sites like Philae and Kalabsha were also relocated. But in gratitude for this international assistance, Egypt gifted several temples away.
Right. The Temple of Debod went to Madrid, and the Temple of Dendur is in New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art.
It's a dispersed legacy. But we have to remember, many other sites, important cemeteries, ancient settlements like the Boone Fort, they were all permanently submerged, lost to history forever.
Let's pivot to the environmental consequences, starting with the biggest flashpoint, the silt. The dam trapped the silt, which is often cited as a catastrophe. But what did your sources find about the actual nutrient value of that silt?
This is where the sources inject some much-needed nuance. While trapping the silt is a major ecological change, its nutrient value was often significantly overestimated. Before the dam, a massive 88% of the sediment carried by the Nile was simply transported out to sea.
So the argument that the dam eliminated the primary source of nutrients is weakened by the data.
Exactly. The total amount of potash, phosphorus, and nitrogen added by the silt was, in the context of modern high-yield agriculture, insignificant compared to what modern fertilizer is required to supply.
So what was the real sediment problem then?
The real problem manifests at the river mouth. Coastal erosion. The Nile Delta, which jets out into the Mediterranean, was historically built and sustained by this constant deposition of new sediment.
And the high dam stops that delivery.
It does. So the lack of new deposits has led to increased coastline erosion along the delta, where the sea is now slowly reclaiming land, a serious and ongoing issue.
And linked to that, the fishing industry suffered an immediate, dramatic collapse.
It was a catastrophic environmental shock. That silt, as it hit the ocean, nourished the plankton blooms that formed the base of the entire coastal ecosystem.
So no silt, no plankton.
And no sardines. The Mediterranean sardine population off the Egyptian coast was decimated. The catch dropped from 18,000 tons in 1962 to a mere 460 tons by 1968.
That's a 97% collapse in 6 years. Just brutal for that industry.
It was. It never truly recovered its former size, though the catch did partially rebound later. A new, though struggling, freshwater fishing industry emerged on Lake Nasser to partially offset the loss.
Okay, so the dam solved the problem of too little water, but its solution, perennial irrigation, created these new, persistent problems of waterlogging and salinity.
And this is the critical, constant battle Egypt now faces. Before the dam, groundwater levels fluctuated widely with the seasonal floods. During the long, dry summer, the water table would drop deep into the earth.
Which was essential because it meant salt couldn't be pulled up to the surface by evaporation.
Precisely. But with perennial irrigation, the water table is constantly high, just a meter or two from the surface. Evaporation consistently draws water up, leaving salt deposits behind at the root level, increasing soil salinity.
So Egypt solved seasonal famine, but created a massive, ongoing problem of soil degradation.
And that problem came with a gargantuan price tag for mitigation. To fight the waterlogging and salinity, Egypt had to embark on a secondary, decades-long project, equipping over 20,000 square kilometers of farmland with massive subsurface drainage systems.
A constant, extremely expensive battle against the very shifts the dam created. What was the investment required for that drainage?
The total investment from 1973 to 2002 was about $3.1 billion.
$3.1 billion.
Let that sink in. It's a staggering amount of money spent over 3 decades, roughly $100 million a year, every year, for 30 years, just managing the inevitable consequences of switching to perennial irrigation. This ongoing cost is a major part of the dam's polarized legacy.
Okay. But before we get to the final assessment, there's a surprising reversal in the health predictions about schistosomiasis or bilharzia.
Right. Many experts predicted that the permanent water from perennial irrigation would cause the waterborne parasite to explode across the country.
But that's not what happened.
No. And this is where the human factor provided a major counterpoint to the predictions. The overall prevalence of schistosomiasis did not increase. In fact, in Upper Egypt, the parasite has actually disappeared entirely.
How is that possible?
The sources suggest 2 reasons. First, the highly populated Delta region had already adopted perennial irrigation decades before the dam, so the damage was already done there. Second, and more importantly, the decline in Upper Egypt was linked to large-scale public health programs in the 90s that used effective single-dose oral medications.
So improved medical interventions and better water management practices overcame the environmental risks.
Exactly. The government intervened decisively, essentially outmaneuvering the biological consequences of the dam.
Any other unexpected environmental changes?
2 more quick ones. First, the water became much clearer without the silt. That allowed sunlight to penetrate deeper, which, combined with fertilizer runoff, drastically increased algae growth.
Which ironically raised the costs of drinking water treatment.
Significantly. And second, there was a major prediction about riverbed erosion downstream.
The idea that the clear water would scour the riverbed.
Right. Initial estimates predicted the riverbed would drop by 2 to 10 meters. The actual measured drop, however, turned out to be much less, only 0.3 to 0.7 meters. So in terms of structural damage downstream, the dam performed better than feared.
So we've covered the immense political success, the engineering scale, the liberation from drought, and the subsequent costs. Relocation, the fishery collapse, and that ongoing mandatory $3.1 billion investment in drainage. How do we synthesize the economic balance sheet?
Immediately following completion, the assessment was fiercely positive. Our sources quote, "The estimated annual economic benefit as substantial, around $587 million in 1970 money."
And the most stunning figure, the sources claim the total construction cost was recovered in only 2 years.
That speed of cost recovery is genuinely rare for such a massive project. But the assessment decades later remains deeply polarized, largely because of that massive continuous mitigation required.
What are the 2 opposing views presented in the sources?
One perspective is that the dam's impacts have been overwhelmingly positive. It argues the environmental problems proved significantly less severe than was generally expected, pointing to the mitigated riverbed erosion and the success against schistosomiasis.
This view champions the dam as the ultimate guarantor of Egypt's food and energy security.
It does, but the opposing view is brutally clear. One observer recommends the dam actually be torn down.
Torn down.
Yes. Their argument is that dismantling it would cost only a fraction of the funds required for continually combating the dam's consequential damage, that relentless, expensive war against salinity and waterlogging. They even argue it would reclaim 500,000 hectares of fertile land currently under the reservoir.
That tension really defines the dam's legacy. A monumental success in providing political independence and water security, sitting right next to an argument that Egypt is now locked into an endless cycle of expensive maintenance.
Yeah. It secured the future against nature, but it now demands a massive ongoing tax, that $3.1 billion drainage investment being the most compelling evidence.
Which brings us to the ultimate, frankly, terrifying thought raised in the sources, the inherent risk of having a structure like this.
Yeah.
We have to discuss the worst-case scenario, a dam breach.
This is where the sheer volume of Lake Nasser becomes an existential threat. The sources describe the theoretical failure of the Aswan Dam as a catastrophic, concentrated, and violent flood event, potentially beyond modern historical comparison.
How catastrophic are we talking? Give us the comparison they used.
The study estimates that a flood from an Aswan Dam breach could be 20 times worse than the infamous 1931 Yangtze River flood in China.
Which caused an estimated 2 to 4 million casualties.
Exactly.
20 times worse. We need to understand the mechanism behind that extreme violence. Why is it so much more destructive than a natural flood?
It's purely about concentration. Lake Nasser holds 132 cubic kilometers of water. A breach means that entire volume is released suddenly, concentrated into a period of maybe plus or minus a day, rather than distributed slowly over 4 months, like a historical flood.
Creating an immediate, violent flood wave.
A wave that would simply overwhelm everything in its path.
What are the specific predicted consequences for Egypt?
Nationwide and fundamentally existential. Millions of homes instantly destroyed. And critically, the sources warn that the nationwide irrigation infrastructure, the very network of canals and drains the dam supports, would be covered by a layer of contaminated heavy sediment,
Which would dry as hard as stone.
effectively annihilating the modern agricultural system. So the failure isn't just a flood, it's a simultaneous economic, infrastructural, and humanitarian collapse,
The country would be thrown back to pre-dam agricultural levels almost overnight.
leading to widespread famine for years. The High Dam is truly an existential structure. Its presence is the guarantor of modern Egyptian life, and its failure would be a national annihilation event.
That is a chilling analysis. It really underscores the enormous responsibility that comes with engineering on this scale.
Indeed. The Aswan Dam provided political independence, energy, and life-saving protection against drought. But those benefits are sustained only through complex, constant, and expensive human management, and ultimately on the eternal integrity of a single, enormous man-made wall holding back a volume of water that just defies imagination.
So what does this all mean for us today, looking back at this story of Cold War ambition and engineering triumph?
The Aswan Dam is a monumental success story in securing a nation's future against the capriciousness of nature and global politics. But it also serves as a permanent lesson. When humanity replaces a wild river with a controlled one, the price of that control is eternal vigilance and constant expensive maintenance to mitigate the new artificial problems we ourselves have engineered.
And here is our final provocative thought for you to mull over. Considering the staggering destructive potential of a theoretical failure described in the sources, a threat 20 times worse than a historical catastrophe, what kind of long-term, potentially infinite responsibility does a nation truly assume when it places 132 cubic kilometers of water storage behind a single enormous man-made wall? The engineering may be a marvel of the past, but the inherent risk is a responsibility that stretches into the endless future. That's a deep dive.